I start now.
Perfect. And if you don't want to appear on video, you can keep your cameras off, of course. So now we have the great pleasure to welcome the participants in today's roundtable, or maybe I should call it a sound table. We all came together because of Resound, the 8th International Conference on the Histories of Media Art, held 2019 in Aalborg, Denmark. So that was the time when we still could meet. And one of the organizers was Morten Søndergaard, who's with us today. He's also the editor, or maybe I should say curator, of the special section in the latest volume of Leonardo Music Journal. And it's now available online. Unfortunately, you need an institutional access, but in 6 months it will be openly available. So our sound table today departs from this special section, and all the contributors except 2 are here. Laura Beloff and Marie Höjlund couldn't make it today, but they're also contributing with articles in this issue. Yeah, and we're joining from different time zones, and I'm very happy you all made it. It's been such a joy to get to know you and your work better. And thank you, Morten, for bringing us all together with all your hard work ever since 2019 and before that, actually. I thought that we could do a quick round of introductions so we can see all the faces. You get to see all the presenters today. So you say hi and where you're calling from and something about yourself. I will call out your names. So Morten Ries, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah. No, me, Morten, not you, Morten.
Yes, Morten Ries.
Yeah, hello, my name is Morten Ries, and I'm a sound artist and researcher. I'm calling from Denmark, where I work as a freelance artist doing concert music and also doing sound installations. And I'm here because I do a lot of collaborative work with Marie Højlund, that is the co-writer of the article in the special issue. And I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Stephanie, are you out there?
Yes. Yes. Hi. I am also really happy to be here. I am a sound artist. Also, I'm calling from upstate New York in a city called Albany, where it is 7 a.m. So I have a very large cup of coffee beside me. And here I work as a lecturer on sound and listening and music and ecology at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I'm also the director of the Center for Deep Listening. Hi.
And Louise.
Hi, I'm Louise Mackenzie. I'm an artist based in the UK. I'm actually calling in from a small area just outside of Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. And I'm a visual artist, but I have increasingly found sound to be a really important part of my practice. And I make installations, and I also work in a very participatory manner, particularly often with scientific communities. And yeah, I'm just really excited to be with you all.
Thank you. Tullis.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Janna. Yeah, I'm Tullis. I'm calling also from the UK. I'm currently living on the south coast of England in a small town called Hastings, right by the sea. And yeah, I'm a composer and sound artist. And I also lecture in sound practices at City University of London. And I think one of my particular research interests, and one of the things I'm talking about in the paper that's part of this special section, is to do with distributed authorship and working with collaborative work with large groups, and particularly with non-professional participants as well.
Thank you. Freya?
Hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be here from dark, rainy, cold Vancouver, 4:20 a.m. I'm a sound artist and researcher in the Critical Media Arts Studio with Gabriela Sepulveda at Simon Fraser University. And my research looks at the geopolitics of sound in borderlands.
Thank you. And Gabriela, over to you.
Hello, thank you everyone. And yes, I'm also connecting from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, otherwise known as Vancouver, British Columbia. It's 4 a.m. here, and I'm a research professor at the School of Interactive Arts and Technology in Simon Fraser University. And and I'm the co-author with Freya on our article in Listening Geopolitics. My research looks at the histories of media art from a feminist perspective, and I'm also a video artist. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And Morten Søndergaard. You're muted.
I know, yes. Hello, I'm calling from Copenhagen, but I'm an associate professor at Aalborg University in art and technology, and we have a master in media arts cultures. Yeah, that's what I would like to say, and I will say a little more later.
Thank you. Sissi, could I ask you to say just a few words about the Posthumanities Hub?
For sure, Janna. But first I want to say a special welcome to all of you who do not know what the Posthumanities Hub is. It's a very interesting creature. It is a very unconventional research group, but it's also something of a research environment that is moving between institutions. And it is also a network of networks. And of course, we are busy doing what we refer to as feminist posthumanities, which is basically about bringing art and science to the humanities, and then hopefully create some transformation in society from that. So that is very, very briefly. I want to just thank you, Janna, for organizing this panel. And I want to welcome, of course, also especially those of you who have been coming to our hub sessions before. And a special welcome to the panelists that I just met. This will be a fantastic session. I'm really eager to listen.
Thank you, Sissi. Yeah, we are 8 participants today on a quite tight schedule. So we've been thinking up a new format for how this could be done. So we will actually pass on questions between us. If you imagine that we're sitting around a big round table, we will pass a question to each other. And then this way we hope that we can both introduce some aspects of all the artists' works, but at the same time in a conversational manner. And even if you haven't read all the articles, you can still get a sense of what we're bringing to the table with this special section of Leonardo. And in this round, we will simply just follow the order of the articles in the Leonardo issue, because it's already been curated, you could say, by Morten Søndergaard in a nice way. So hopefully the issues will kind of open up, unfold as we go along. And this conversation, roundtable or sound table, will go on for about an hour. And after that, Morten will moderate a short discussion, and after that we will have a Q&A, questions and answers, for the last 15 minutes. So if you have questions popping up while you're listening, you can write them in the chat, and Sissi will keep an eye on them, And if there are many, maybe some kind of digest, or just take them in the order they appear. So hopefully we will have time to kind of continue the conversation with all of you somehow, even though we are such a massive bunch of people. And we will end at 3. But before we begin with this roundtable, I just want to ask you, Morten Søndergaard, to please say something about the topic, sound as evidence.
Yes, thank you, Janna. Also, thank you for putting all this together. It's quite amazing to be able to and see you all here in this way. Since until now, it's been the reading activity that has brought us together. Now we can actually speak to each other. It's very nice. As you kind of hinted, Janna, I do see this work with this special section of Leonardo as a curatorial rather than an editorial process, even though, of course, editorial element is very much part of it. But by that, I actually mean that in some ways I've been addressing some of the issues that would also maybe go into real curatorial work, in the sense of making an exhibition, which is actually to expose different artistic and theoretical ideas to each other, and make them either meet each other in a dialogue, or to maybe expose new ideas, or maybe some conflicts, or some critical aspects that would need some attention in the situation that we are in. And by that I mean a geopolitical crisis, which was already in the making before COVID, actually. So this is, of course, work that goes that started before the COVID lockdown, even before we knew that would happen. But it's still something that addresses some of these post-human and situations and questions, but also the very question of what post-humanistic work might be. And again, since I'm a curator, then I'm usually very curious about stuff, but I noticed that my curiosity wasn't enough anymore. I was actually disappointed in my own curiosity in a way. So I wanted to, it needed another layer. When I speak about it, just normally I talk about, I hate the word meta, but it's a little bit like that. It's a meta curatorial level that addresses the ethics, the morals, the very essences, or the very basic elements of this, you could say, point degré zéro, with Barth's quotation of our situation and how we operate in it, right? So all this is about how to operate and how to approach it. I write a little about aesthetics and aesthetic approximations, and that is actually also speaking to the fact that I'm really in doubt about many of these things, and so trying through this special section actually to address some of these doubts and fears maybe also that I have. So I see this section, the special section, I saw that as an exhibition in a way of it's an exhibition that circulated approaches and problems of all these matters and textualities and indeterminate stuff that were I could see that were around me or surrounded us in this situation of geopolitical crisis, as I addressed it in 2019, and so and also trying to describe these issues in different ways through the specifically through the work that the authors present have done, and not trying to just think it from one perspective. So of course, to bring in these different perspectives on these questions. So I don't want to take much more time. I just want to also briefly state where the idea came from, because in 2018, I noticed that there was a site, and I start by addressing this also in my introduction, a new site in Denmark called Lyden af Danmark, or the Sound of Denmark, which was aiming at collecting sounds recorded by people living in Denmark. So it's a kind of ethnographic, you could say, or ecological work was the idea. At the time when I accessed it, and I accessed it again just a few days ago, it was mainly made up of sounds from, bird singing and lawnmowers and stuff that, of course, is going on sonically in our world, but it did not include other sounds from more critical aspects, like why were there no sounds from the refugee asylums, or from you could say more political conflicts. At that time, we didn't have the COVID yet, but after the COVID, there's been no recordings actually of any of that activity, which is surprising. So from this silence actually grew the editorial idea, you could say, and curatorial, meta-curatorial idea as well for the special section. And it grew as a question: how can sound-based work or sound-based phenomena function as evidence of the situation we are in? How can we evidence the post-human world? And also the challenges, how can we address them? It's clear that we cannot just use the known methods and known approaches without finding a meta layer that addresses why and how we are using those approaches and methods. And with that follow the other questions, as I mentioned in the introduction. Are the crises we are witnessing actually crises in how we are representing non-human and human relations based on the mediation of data, or in mediation of empirical knowledge? Does it call for a reconstruction of the technology of evidence on the basis of how data is approached in the relational field between non-human and human agencies? And that's and then it's kind of launched from there, and I started reading through the many wonderful papers that were submitted for the Resound conference in 2019, and the selection of papers that are here to be presented today came out of that reading, and also from a realization that all of you present here today are addressing this matter and these questions and these doubts and this crisis in different ways, but are also leading us towards new methods, and that was important for me to find these papers that were actually addressing new methods of operationalizing how we can operate with evidence, evidencing the postmodern world and postmodern sensibilities. And with that, I think I will pass on the baton to what is really exciting and what I'm really looking forward to to the discussions and dialogues that are now going to take place. So thank you for the word, and I will later lead a little bit of discussion.
Thank you, Morten. Then we'll start the conversation around the table. And first out is Morten Rees posing a question to me as it happens.
Yes. Hello, Janna. I'll just do a really quick summary of your article, if for those who haven't read it. But basically, it's sort of a revisit of the research of John C. Lilly's experiments with interspecies communications between dolphins and humans, and he conducted a series of experiments in the 1960s with humans living with dolphins and investigating. Is it possible to communicate with non-human entities? And for me, there is a lot of really interesting perspectives and questions in this article, and it all sort of centers around the notion of listening. But what I'm sort of curious in talking to you about today, Janna, is sort of the role of listening, both sort of from a human perspective, but also from a non-human perspective. So also taking in the role of technological listening, because what is really interesting in the text is that the experiments done in the 60s, they all had sort of the notion that the dolphins started to imitate human sounds. So the researchers would hear the dolphins speak to them in the water, and they did a series of recordings of these words. But very interestingly, when they played back these recordings, it wasn't possible to hear the sound, the human speaking sounds anymore. And for me, that sort of raises questions about, of course, mediation, but also listening. And the researchers at that time made a series of sort of experiments with sort of slow pitching down the tape and pitching up the tape in order to, can we hear the human-like sounds when we manipulate technology, and that wasn't the question either. So my question to you now is it only because they used is it because of the limitations of the analog tape recorder that they couldn't sort of encapsulate or remediate the dolphins speaking? And today we have sort of the possibility to record ultra and subsonic frequencies. So today, is it possible to sort of capture these sensations that the researchers had in the water with the dolphins, or is it something else that is at stake here?
Yes, thank you, Morten. Thank you for the reading. Yeah, you could say that Lilly basically wanted to record proof that what they heard had actually been said, but when they played it back to other researchers, they couldn't hear the same thing. And Lilly basically approached the microphone or the recording gear as a camera, you could say, trying to capture sound objects that could be viewed and reviewed as static evidence of sonic occurrences later. And if today's technology would have changed his research, in a sense, no, it wouldn't have changed his conclusions, because his knowledge practice and theoretical framing was disembodied and reductive at heart. That's what I try to get at in this article. So his conclusions would probably have been the same even if he had more advanced technology. He was already aware of the limitations. He knew that they were only capturing a very tiny fraction of the sonic information. And he also noted that the dolphins actually adjusted their frequency range because they quickly found out that humans couldn't hear them. So what I propose is that Lilly deletes bodies, environments. He deletes sociability, material agencies, and relations as irrelevant to his study. And his knowledge, tradition, and knowledge practice allows him to do that. It even urges him to do that. He zooms in on only the sound object, as he calls it. It's completely decontextualized and made static. And language is reduced to code. And communication, in turn, is reduced to transmission of that code. And he focuses only on the dolphin's ability to imitate English words with their blowhole in a lab setting, far remote from any kind of natural habitat that the dolphins would usually communicate with each other in. But interestingly enough, meanwhile, his assistant, Margaret Howe, was venturing quite deep into interspecies communication in a completely different way, through living together with the dolphin day and night for 2.5 months in a water-filled home. And Lily is very appreciative of her ability to handle the dolphins, to be with them. But he refers to this as motherly abilities, kind of natural abilities occurring because she's a woman. And somehow he lumps together all these other relational, environmental, material aspects into motherly abilities and not relevant for the study he was doing. If he had turned his attention to bodily interactions and the affordances of the environment and the importance of play in generating a site-specific and mutual language, his conclusions and methods would probably have changed radically. But all this is considered noise. It's too messy to be considered useful. He has to focus and narrow down in order to generate results in the scientific framing he operates within. And care and attunement and time is completely out of the picture. But this, I think, is where listening begins.
Yeah, and then you sort of revisit this this archive of these recordings, and you so you sort of re-listen to these recordings, and then I'm just looking for the quote. But because in the text you very interesting and very thought provocative state that I find it humbling to think of every recording as an act of erasure rather than as a document or evidence. And then you continue, while media might be fixed, listening is still fluid and dynamic. And I think that's a very interesting line of thinking. And maybe you could expand on that a little, but also maybe take into account the thinking and writing of Wolfgang Ernst and Friedrich Kittler, because when you state that media is static and listening is dynamic, I mean they propose a very different perspective on media that is dynamic, fragile, living, and forever changing. So I don't know if you could expand on that a bit. Thank you.
Yes, I try. Yeah, you're right. You're right. To think of the recording as an erasure for me works as a reminder of what has been omitted, the silence part that also Morten Søndergaard spoke about. And how do I deal with that? How can I care for the excluded? And also, on the other hand, how can I avoid being seduced by a kind of trophy hunt that field recording sometimes can become, like the capture of the awesome sound? And how can I materially, in my own installations that involve sound or listening, story and restory entanglements, all that has been left out of the scene? And one way is to reveal the performativity of the media. I never work with sound as a single composition. It's always part of an installation or a situation or an apparatus, if you wish. That's why I found like the lab an interesting site to visit, because the lab is also a setup, an installation that affords, restricts, suggests behaviors and relations, just as an art installation does. And Lily treated media as if it was fixed. But all these exclusions come back to haunt him, you could say, when he listens back to the recordings, because listening is situated and embodied, and the media performs differently depending on who is listening, and where and how, and what they're listening for. So the noise is the message, you could say, or your noise might be my data, depending on what we're listening out for. So yes, I agree with Kittler, but I understand this dynamic co-becoming of beings and materialities in Karen Barad's words of interaction. So I turn to new materialist lines of thinking to engage with precisely this, how media is fluid, not fixed. Or rather, I understand her writing through my experiences of listening. They start to make a lot of sense to me because of my listening experiences. And in return, listening and situated practices might offer a tentative and more careful and more diverse modes of knowing, and maybe give back, some of these, make these this liveliness even of media tangible somehow.
Yeah. I don't know if I have time for just a very brief question. Is it you that are you controlling the time, Janna?
Yeah, maybe I think we used our 10 minutes.
Okay.
To save the question, maybe?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah.
But thank you for your very elaborate and interesting answers.
I loved your questions. I will ask some questions to Stephanie. I just have to locate you on my screen.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for your wonderful text. Since I'm too is interested in what the gaze does and what listening might undo or do differently, I find your relational and feminist approach to listening and walking very productive. In your article, you investigate a turn from the eye to the ear in the practice and also literature of walking as art. And here the figure of the flaneur, of course, stands out, even though depicted by Guy Debord and Michel de Certeau as a tactic of creative resistance. Walking is in their writing, as you show, predominantly concerned with what is seen. And you argue for listening as a feminist and ecologically oriented mode of engaging with the world, where listening is a way to shake the habitual, so to speak. And as a counter figure, you introduce, I'm sorry for my really bad French, but flaneuserie sonore. So instead of the flaneur who sees, the flaneuserie sonore whose attention is directed to listening. And you do this to tease out what feminist sound walking could be and do. So my first question to you is, what does this figure mobilize? And at the same time, what traps might we risk being caught in when we think along with this figure?
Okay. Wait, I'm unmuted. Good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Janna, so much. Yeah, so what does this figure mobilize? I really had fun proposing this figure precisely because of the way that it counters the sort of culturally entrenched figure of the flaneur, who really embodies this like white, upper class, able-bodied, male privilege and entitlement, really, right? Like having the leisure and the ability to move unhindered in public space, right? Sort of freely, unencumbered. And so, yes, I propose flâneuserie sonore as a practice that would be, or that is feminist, that is relational, that is aware of its own positionality, and that as it moves through the world walking, mobilizes an ethics of maybe connection and entanglement rather than the detached observation that we get with the flaneur. And then there are maybe some traps in that figure as well, as you rightly point out. And I would say first would be sort of misunderstanding the proposal of feminist sound walking as being simply about women, right? Rather than understanding its feminism as an ethical orientation that can be practiced by, right, any sex or gender orientation, and that works to undo structural power imbalances. So that's what the feminism is about, not about bodies. And then the second risk would be that the turn from eye to ear be understood to mean that the eye can only ever be used to objectify, or that the ear can only ever be used to connect. When, of course, the ear can be used to ignore, to surveil, to hear rather than listen. You know, I'm thinking also about the work of Indigenous scholar Dylan Robinson and his concept of hungry listening, which is listening to extract, to instrumentalize, or to control, right? So that there's no simple association between these sensory modes and different ways of operating in the world, but we can think through them, and they have different potentialities maybe.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Maybe you want to put that in the chat, the hungry listening.
Yes, I will.
Reference. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I'll look it up after. Yeah. Proper link. Yeah.
You also write that practices of listening and walking can seed new relationships to the world around us. And in dialogue with the practices of artists such as Pauline Olivieros and Hildegard Westerkamp, Susan Thorpe, Viv Corringham, and Amanda Gutierrez, you offer some examples of what a feminist take on walking as listening offers that I find beautifully captured. So you offer listening as a shared orientation, listening as a participatory practice, listening as environmental entanglement. And personally, I understand these to be more or less interrelated. Could you please say something more, elaborate on what this means in practice for you, and especially listening as environmental entanglement?
Okay. So thank you again. Yeah, they are very interrelated for sure. And so I guess just elaborating a bit, I talk about both listening as a shared orientation and as a participatory practice in thinking about artistic or musical projects that really share authorship with other listeners, like Tullis was saying, this distributed, I think, authorship. And so, and for me, these listeners might be humans, but they might also be environments, which also listen in different ways. And so a really key touchstone for me in this has been Pauline Oliveros's participatory scores, where the compositions themselves emerge from participants listening and vocally responding to themselves, to each other, and to their surroundings, to the degree that it's really the relationality and the community negotiation that constitute the piece. And what emerges from that is prioritized over any specific musical goals or any output, right, that would be preconceived. And so in terms of all the other artists that you mentioned that I bring in, I see this same sort of spirit of shared authorship and sensitivity to relationship in Viv Corringham's work, where her compositions emerge from her recordings of and her responses to these meaningful walks, as she puts it, that these different individuals take her on in different parts of the world. In Amanda Gutierrez's work, it's really conversations with women of color that form the content of the work, whether through the suggestion of places to walk, or sharing experiences of comfort or discomfort in public space, or through brainstorming civic interventions. And so those are all, for me, like different kinds of environmental entanglements. But in the paper, I was using that term specifically in thinking about Suzanne Thorpe's piece called Resonance and Resemblance. And then in her piece, it's the sonic qualities of a sort of natural, in quotes, outdoor environment that is the co-composer, or are the co-composers of the piece. In that the compositional decisions in terms of the sounds that are placed in the space were based on the acoustic resonances of that space. So it's like a response to the acoustic phenomena in the space. But then also the listeners, the audience, were very carefully and thoughtfully instructed to, or brought to a place of, including the full environment and all of its soundings and all of their experience of it within the frame of the piece, right? So kind of expanding that frame of the piece to include the full environments. So I don't know if that elaborates enough for now.
Yeah, thank you. I think you mentioned some quite powerful practices for experiencing environmental entanglement. And the last question is maybe a question I pose not only to you, but to everyone, and also myself recurrently. I think there's a lot to be gained from turning from eye to ear, but this turn also makes me ask, what does the ear return to the eye?
Great. I love that question. Thank you. Okay, so there's two ways that I think I would respond to that. And the first is, so the first, or maybe this sets the terms, is that one of the things that I try to do in my paper is to think about listening as an approach to the world that that maybe emerges from some of the characteristics of sonic perception, the way that it's immersive, the way that it's ever present, the way that it's co-constitutive, the way that it's time-based, but at the same time that it's not synonymous with the ear, as I was saying. And so what I think in that sense, what the ear can return to the eye is an awareness of interdependence, which we can learn about from listening, from the way that we're impacted by sounds, or the way that our bodies contribute to our acoustic environment, right? And are then part of it, which we then listen to. And also a practice of receptivity that we can learn from the time and the space and the attention that truly listening demands, right? This kind of listening as an approach might then be able to offer tools for an entangled sensory engagement that that can, if I can segue, as attested in Louise Mackenzie's paper, which I have the pleasure of asking questions about in a moment, that can equally be enacted in ways of seeing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those answers. I leave it to you and Louise.
Great, great. Thank you, Janna. Let me see if I can locate Louise.
Hi.
Hello, you're right there. Beautiful. Okay, wonderful. So I have written out my question for you to make sure that I kind of get it right. So I'm going to read this, but thank you so much for your really beautiful paper. So as someone who's extremely interested in the sensory orientation of deep listening, I really appreciate how you bring looking and listening together to consider how tools of perception can create intimacy and understanding, but also distance and misrepresentation. Your article begins in this really beautiful moment by pulling us into your initial experience of intimacy with a microorganism, D. salina. Is that okay? Wait a second. I couldn't say the whole first D word. That you were viewing through a simple microscope. Your text then traces a beautiful and compelling path as you try to recapture that experience through layered technological representations and translations in order to then share it with others in the form of an art installation, Stars Beneath Our Feet, which was displayed at night as a projection that recreated your initial experience of the microorganism as a celestial body. The tools that you use to do this, microscopes, microphones, etc., are designed to reveal ever more clarity and understanding as tools. But as your process reveals, increased visibility and audibility doesn't necessarily create or recreate the embodied and imaginative understanding that you experienced when first looking through the simple microscope. So for me, there's a beautiful tension in your work between the use of scientific tools born out of the desire to see and hear with limitless clarity, and your desire to see and listen in order to experience relation and connection. So my first question to you is simply, do you experience this as a generative tension in your work?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Stephanie, for such a rich question. And it's really helped me to reflect actually on this tension specifically and its generative capacity, which I've realized is an ongoing theme for me. I mean, the work, just to recap a tiny bit, first came about when I viewed, they're called Dunaliella Selina. I'm probably not pronouncing that entirely correctly, but then I'm sure they wouldn't call themselves that either. So, but, I first viewed them in a lab where I'd been advised by the scientist I was working with to dim the lights to help me see them. So I dimmed the lights right down and saw these beautiful kind of their bodies reflected against the light of the microscope against this black background. And it's the image that I think was used in part of this sort of information for this. So some people may have seen the image. And it really drew me into their world, because rather than that static image, I was looking at them moving. And I just had this sense of wanting to be in amongst them. And I also felt then that in order to experience being in amongst them, I would be able to somehow hear them, which is what drew me to make a work that was both audio and visual. And but coming back to your point about this generative tension, for me, I think that kind of tension it sits somewhere between curiosity and wonder. And it's this, for me, I think it's something that's very much rooted in this ongoing relationship I have with scientific practices, because it's something that I think you see this curiosity in science, but you also see, I think, perhaps maybe the first time a scientist looks through the microscope, they will have the same sense of wonder, which quickly fades as they start to get curious about the organisms that they might want to explore at a much higher resolution and a much greater magnitude of detail than the image that captured my attention. So yeah, and then just generally in relation to socially engaged elements of other practices here in the discussion that we're having today. I mean, my current kind of creative focus is on this dialogue that sits at this point of tension. So particularly with scientific communities and making work that embraces that and allows a multitude of potentially conflicting voices to be heard at once. So now, of course, I'm talking more about human voices than the voices of the organism. So, for example, I've made a film-based work called Zone of Inhibition, which was based on a workshop that I ran where I invited different disciplines to reflect on the process of genetic modification. And then I collaged together their responses into one voice, as it were. And in my current research, I'm also, again, exploring what I would maybe describe as the voices of unconnected individuals who form a community through a particular subject. So communities that wouldn't normally come together, but yet they've got a common interest. And in one project, the interest is waste. And in another, the interest is the many forms of research that use human cells. So again, in these projects, I'm trying to bring voices that come from very different perspectives and pull them together. So yeah, I really thank you for that question, because it helped me to think about the fact that I'm trying to use that tension as a generative force, and it's quite a vital and important element in my practice.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm not cutting you off, am I?
No.
Okay, great. All right, so this is kind of I guess a follow-up question, really. So I'm wondering what for you is the value of clarity versus obscureness. So once something is visible or audible, what is the optimum level of resolution? And do different relationships call for different levels of magnification? And how might we find those in relation?
Okay, so I think this is a really great question, because it taps into these questions of authorship and ethics and aesthetics that run through, I think, a lot of the papers that we're talking about today. And the first thing that I want to say is that as an artist, I think it's really important to embrace the obscure and to play in these kind of grey spaces where things are not clear. But also, I tend to work primarily in these scientific spaces. That's what I've spent probably the last 5 years of my practice doing. And so I'm interested in a clarity through the way I practice in order to perhaps reveal what science might otherwise obscure through having a focused lens in one direction. So, coming back to the Dunaliella Selena, where scientists might be looking at them in a very detailed, specific way, it was this other really kind of celestial and well, actually coming back to something you said, Janna, earlier, I wrote it down, the trophy hunt for the awesome sound. This was the awesome image for me, this image that made me then want to hunt for an awesome sound that would sit alongside this image. So I think, Stephanie, coming back to what you're saying, you're right to suggest that these ideas of clarity and obscurity can operate at lots of different levels, because for me with this work, it was about not so much about clarity and obscurity, but about clarity and choice. So I wasn't dealing with the clarity of a sound recording, for example, but with the way a sound is generated. So not so much obscuring information, but making choices about the ways in which to generate sound from information through translation. And for me, working in this scientific context, I think that kind of clarity was really important at this level, because sound can be so representative, and I think that's something really important to consider in making sound works, particularly in a scientific context. So, for example, there's a cat in the background, I'm not sure if you can hear. So, for example, the first interpretation of these organisms through sound that I was able to capture, the sound came across as very mechanistic, and it didn't at all embody the sort of experience that I had first felt of what it might be like to swim with the organisms. Whereas in actual fact, that sound in many ways was a more true depiction of how we listen to microorganisms, because we are only ever listening to them through technology. They are impossible, if you like, to hear through any other means. So that was something that I think, is particularly of interest to me. Excuse me, I'm so sorry, but I'm going to let this cat out because you're going to be able to hear it. I beg your pardon. Talking of listening intently to your environment, exactly.
I think that we're just about out of our time. Thank you so much for all of these different ideas and approaches, and maybe we'll find ways to talk more. I will pass it on to you now to carry the baton forward.
Thank you. So I have some questions here for Tullis, but first of all, I will try to summarize briefly Tullis as best I can. So in your article, you really succinctly developed the case for a sociosonic methodology, as you describe it, where distributed authorship and disruption are critical features, really, of a socially engaged sound art practice. And so your article begins by summarising positions on participatory art practice, contrasting Nicolas Bourriaud's relational aesthetics, where the artist retains conceptual control, with Grant Kester's collaborative concept of reciprocal creative labour, where autonomy is more distributed. And then you go on to identify through Claire Bishop that collaboration can actually lack criticality. And you say, and I'm quoting here, potentially risking non-engagement or exclusion for an identified or othered community. So you then offer an ethically engaged understanding of participation and collaboration as attitudes that can disrupt neoliberal agendas through displacing or rupturing traditional hierarchies of creator and listener. And you introduce us to three contemporary socially engaged sound practices, including your own work, Walls on Walls, through which you question to what degree can the sound artist seed control and distribute authorship. And it's clear from the examples that you share that there are trade-offs between the aesthetics and the ethics and the politics, which I found really compelling to think about. And I wondered if you could expand upon this, please.
Thank you, Louise. That's I'm so chuffed to have your succinct resume of the paper, and thanks for engaging with it, and for such a thoughtful question. Yeah, I think so. Just to sort of expand a little bit on some of the examples I'm providing in the paper. The first that is discussed is by Kate Carr, a London-based sound artist. And so she works with a variety, quite a large group, mainly of young people. And the collaborative efforts of their listening and recording and engagement with the local environment that they all live in and share is heard through this piece, which I think is really interesting because in terms of we're talking here about the aesthetics or ethics or politics and the trade-off that a distributed approach to authorship can have. I think in Kate Carr's work, we can really hear that in the aesthetics, because there are a lot of what might not typically be included in a professional composer or sound artist's final work, i.e. distortions or various different handling noise, bumps on the microphone, young people getting really excited and sort of perhaps straying from the train of thought that they should be listening to the sound environment, should in inverted commas, and instead sort of whispering into the microphone and playing around with the technology. And there's all these sort of variety of sounding elements, including kind of what might otherwise have ended up on the cutting room floor, that become privileged and become presented in the work. And so I think that starts to disrupt the sense of the professional facilitator and their oversight, and starts to create a bit more of a hierarchical, a non-hierarchical collaborative approach to sound. And it's quite a simple example of that, or quite a succinct or useful example of that. And I think the piece is wonderful as well. It's full of vibrant activity from a lot of these young people exploring with recording devices and microphones, and perhaps working in ways which are less familiar to them. Another really interesting example, I think, is the work of Jacqueline Waldock, and she works with a community of residents who were living in Liverpool in the UK, and they were subject to what's called a compulsory purchase order on their housing, which is essentially where the local authority would work very hard to force them out of their houses in order to buy up the entire street or the entire neighbourhood and then serve that for redevelopment. And so there were long-standing residents who were very actively involved in resisting this compulsory purchase order. And Jacqueline Waldock, as a sound art researcher, ethnographer, worked with them to use sound recording as a way of reflecting on this continued situation. And so what's interesting about this is a number of things. I think partly the sound recording in that distributed way provides an understanding of sounding that would not be available were the artist to be present. So the sound recording devices and the ideas of discussing listening in that context were left up to those participants, and they identified all sorts of sounding elements which, like I said, wouldn't have been available had the artist been present at the same time. That sort of imbalance would have created different scenarios, she concludes. And also what's interesting, I think, is that Waldock doesn't really privilege the sound recording as the document of this event. That process was the most important thing. She happens to then end up writing about it in an academic chapter, but that's sort of secondary to the act of doing the work. And so there's this sort of disruption or this imbalance again, where actually the sound isn't presented eventually. It's not really easy to find. There aren't many residual elements of that activity in sound, even though the focus was in sound. So I think that's really interesting as a kind of disruptive sort of approach to this sense of working with a number of people. And then I also discussed my own work, which is Walls on Walls, which is an audiovisual project, I should say. It collaborates with a visual artist, and then we've worked with a variety of other collaborators from different fields. And my role as a sound artist in that project is to try and facilitate some sense of dialogic editing, some group discussion around any stage of a collaborative sound piece. So there's a lot of to and fro, and I think this is where visual art critics such as Bishop or Kester are quite useful to engage with the ideas that I think have gone quite far in the discussion in the visual realm, or the visual criticized world, and perhaps less so in sound, to do with the perhaps supposed position that any form of participation is a positive force, and how to kind of contest that a little bit. I feel like I've been talking for a little while, so maybe I'll stop.
No, I wanted to give you the space because I know we're so short of time, and yet you've actually covered quite a lot of the content of my questions by doing that. But I think you've picked up on some really interesting points, and just the one other question that I would ask then, I think, is to say, in your own, I'm coming on to your own work, Walls on Walls, and how in that you actually highlight this opportunity that participatory sound has for opening up this dialogue, as you've been saying, and also you mentioned this, this idea of the collaborative compositional approach as well. And so what I wanted to ask is if you see that this opening up of dialogue as disruptive in and of itself, and in addition, how you might consider the resulting artwork to also be disruptive.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So I think Yeah, in terms of whether opening up the kind of dialogue is disruptive, I think it definitely should be for the artist. That's the first thing to say, is if we're thinking about this sense of a flatter, more non-hierarchical structure for facilitating collaboration in sound, that should certainly disrupt the artist's practice and the outcomes of that in some way. I think that's really important, and we can hear that in the example of Kate Carr's work, as I was talking about before. And I think that the artwork might disrupt listening habits, I wonder, as well. And I was sort of reflecting on this and thinking about maybe an example, and one that came to mind was in Walls on Walls. We've continually worked with communities who live in social housing in central London, and involving a wide variety of participants in terms of age range and various other ways of thinking about the mixture of the group. But one young participant was delighted to be able to hear their own recording and hear their own work as part of this. And so that particular piece has had so many more plays on SoundCloud than any of the others, because he's obsessed with it and plays it to anyone who comes into the house, and plays it over and over again and sends it around. So I think what's interesting about that is I wonder if that presentation of a piece of sound composition which might otherwise disrupt the listening of that person, the person that engages with the other people that person engages with, whether listening back to their home environment might then change their listening habits outside in the way that perhaps Stephanie was talking about previously. So I wonder if that is a sort of disruptive influence in and of itself.
I think that's a really good point to unfortunately to close on for our brief part of the conversation. Thank you so much, Tullis.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I am going to be moving on to talk with Freya and Gabriella. Hello.
Hi, Tony.
First, congratulations for being up at this time on the West Coast. Well done. It's wonderful to have you here, particularly at that time in the morning for you. So I thoroughly enjoyed getting to know your work through the paper that you've presented in the journal, and I'll just present a brief summary for those who haven't managed to engage with it. So the title is Listening, Geopolitics and the Anthropocene Contact Zones in Bali and the Georgia Straits. And so you argue towards listening as a practice of political activism, which I think is really thought-provoking in and of itself. And what I think was particularly engaging for me in terms of the article was how deftly you seem to move between global themes and quite large-scale discussion of geopolitical contact zones and post-colonial power structures, and a sort of constructive critique of listening and the Anthropocene. And we move between those kind of discursive themes towards very intimate first-person narratives of listening as active political activism, cited in Bali and also in the Georgia Straits. And those examples, I think, you point out how politically and commercially loaded many maritime areas or these border zones are around the world. And so I wanted to ask you both about the way in which it was really striking to me how equitably you write the multi-species approach to the sort of more than human in your paper. And this goes back to some of the conversations I think that Morten and Janna were having earlier. And so I wondered if you could just maybe say a bit more about listening, about activism and the technological approach, particularly with regard to the water-bound populations that you're talking about in these examples in your article. I wonder, is this something that was specific towards the paper, or is it more of a long-term approach? And I wonder, what scope there is for reciprocation.
Thank you so much, Tullis. That's a great intro. And I love this question. It's really got me thinking a lot more about the idea of reciprocity in the context of listening as activism, and then the part that technology can play in that. And it's got me thinking about how sound can generate, inspire, and enable the inaction of reciprocity. I think first, I just wanted to acknowledge the history of what it means to go to a place and observe beings that are considered other, and how as human listeners in these spaces, we automatically create an unequal power dynamic through our presence. So I think it's important to situate ourselves within that historical context in order to challenge or problematize this idea of reciprocity and its potential through sound and listening. And also be cognizant that humans are the problem. So in some senses, I think it's our job to just listen and not expect anything back. But building on this foundation, I think there can be reciprocity on different, maybe indirect levels. I think by inserting ourselves into these spaces, we already have a kind of embodied reciprocity in terms of the porosity of our bodies and the sharing of oxygen and water and this perpetual recycling of elemental matter that we're part of. And secondly, I think building on Donna Haraway's idea of becoming with, I think there's a way that we can learn to listen with rather than listen to. And this can be an intent and a practice, and that's where technological mediation can come in. And I think one of the amazing things now about the current state of listening technologies is that we can employ them to uncover that which is hidden and utilize their potential to illuminate the shy or the inaudible or the sonic that's beyond our normal register of understanding. When I was taking the recordings of the Bali Strait, and I was out on a boat, and there was this wonderful moment with my hydrophone dropped down into the water, listening to the fish and the snapping shrimps, where some of the marine creatures would bump up against the hydrophone, and I could hear the contact of their bodies with the technology. And so in some way, it felt like there was this little connection between the agency of their physicality and then my own embodied process of feeling and listening and the technology. So I think there was this kind of reciprocity there. And so within the context of technology, and I wonder if the deep in listening could be found within the agental relations between bodies in these spaces, and maybe the act of mediated listening in these spaces with the intent to generate reciprocity of some kind can open up ways of engaging that we hadn't have thought of before.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to add to that wonderful response. Just to say that it was really amazing to co-write and with Freya and bounce ideas back and forth in reciprocity.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I hope, Janna, we just have time for a follow-up question then, which is to do with, I guess, this listening with and this technologically mediated listening that you so carefully contextualize and position within the written paper. And I guess I have a sort of more speculative question, which is, do you think it's at all appropriate to consider ways of sharing this in non-textual format? If we move into sharing these recordings or perhaps into kind of creative sound practice responses to the kind of listening that you're doing, what do we gain or what do we lose, or how what are the discrepancies or the difficulties of not writing through the listening with but presenting the listening in sound itself?
Oh, thank you so much. I think it's appropriate to use text. I think I'm going to propose that rather than losing anything, it can be an opportunity to delve into sound from a different angle and use words to connect and build bridges and situate ourselves through language, and explore the sonic from another angle. And I think that also relates to this idea of listening as activism and the activist stance of listening, which Gabriella and I define as an intentional orientation towards the sonic as a way to inspect political crisis. And so I think writing is definitely, there's definitely a place for the written word within that, for sure. Yeah, I can say a bit more about listening as activism if we have time, but I'm aware of the time. And how are we doing, do you think?
Give it one more minute and then pose your questions to Morten.
Okay. So yes, I think it's really interesting how all the papers in this section talk about practices of listening and conducting research in a sensory and embodied way as a critique to objectivity. So this opens out the idea of listening as a way to disrupt or unsettle the hegemonic frameworks of Western modernity. So I think it's interesting to conceive of listening as activism as a decolonial practice. This goes back to what Morten was saying at the beginning about silencing. There's a really great, Roland Vasquez has a really great way of defining decolonial listening. He talks about decolonial listening as the task of bridging the colonial difference and a practice that draws our attention to that which has been erased. So I think this erasure was really evident in the recordings that we took, and in fact in all of the works that have been discussed here, we're all touching on this idea of erasure in some way. So with that, I will pass the baton on to Mary and Morten. Thank you, Tullis. Thank you. So Mary and Morten discuss their project Nephew vs. Overheard, whereby over the course of 1 year, the real-time movement of a wind turbine was mixed with songs by the Danish band Nephew. The strength of the wind and therefore the movement of the blades related directly to the tempo that the songs were played at. So on windier days, when the wind turbine was rotating faster, the songs were faster, and vice versa the other way around. Listeners were invited to tune into the project and listen in real time to the wind turbine. Through this collaboration between artists and the wind and various forms of technology, the authors explore how the materiality of the wind turbine and also the embodied experience of the listener acts as transducers of the sonic. Through this process of movement, exchange, and translation, the project celebrates the messy inconsistencies of the way that sound is interpreted. And because the project was spread spatially and temporally, it unsettles our concept of what a work of art can be and makes direct commentary to the ways that a work of art can be related to across time. So Gabriella and I came up with some questions for you, Morten, for your great paper. You talk about that it's essential to experiment with transductive chains of local environmental data to create sensibilities that we can relate to in our everyday environments in order to effectively engage and connect people to climate change in ways that they feel directly implicated. I hope you could unpack for us a little what you mean by transductive chains of environmental data.
Yes. Thank you for the introduction. We use transduction both as a method to work artistically, but also as a way to think through the various change of translations or mediation that sound goes through. So these transductive changes are, of course, I mean, wind as data. So the rotation of the windmill is also it's a number, and that number is then, of course, affecting the time stretch algorithm. But but also the change, the transductive change when actually being on site or being near a windmill, and hopefully sort of unfold this the concept of a windmill as a tuning relation. So for us in Denmark, which is covered in windmills, windmills become a static problem. But on the other hand, they also, because there is a lot of debate around the noisiness, and they sort of block the nature and so on. But for us, they are these sort of, they are evidence of our infrastructure. So in a way, the windmill becomes an open wound, a bleeding open wound, because we can't close our eyes to this massive infrastructure that we all need in order for our technological society to unfold. So in a way, because of the way that the project was spread out throughout the year and through different mediation platforms, it sort of points towards these various messy change of transductions and translations, and all from a sort of a central central perspective. So it is these translation. So the windmill is not just creating energy. It's also creating sound, and it's also it can generate data, and that data can be used for artists to interpret, or it could be used for scientists to interpret. So it's sort of, the project is hopefully pointing towards this endless change of translations going on. And also sort of the interpretation of it, because we normally think of sort of when the term environmental data, you almost, it requires some kind of interpretation. And often that is within a scientific or a political context. So we are sort of, it's always an interpretation, and we are trying to use that very actively in this artwork.
Thank you. And relating to that, could you you talk about the windmill acting as a transducer, and also the human body acting as a transducer, and within the context of renewable energies, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the human body as a tool through which to translate what you describe as the imaginary of sound.
Yeah. I mean, for us, the imaginary potential of sound, the imaginary potential that sound have, is that sound itself does not exist. It's always sound to something, or sounding through something. So when we are listening to a windmill, what is it that we are hearing? Are we hearing the wings, or are we hearing air molecules, or are we hearing electricity? And all these questions that come up when we listen to the windmill, that stimulate our imagination on what it is, what we are, what we are. We are these transductive bodies that do these kind of translations constantly. So in a way, sound is sort of stimulating our imagination to sort of think outside ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. So just related to that, you also talk about the links of affectivity with technological creatures. And I hoped you could explore a little more about how this idea relates to what you were saying about the affective and embodied experience of sound, and how that can be evaluated within the context of evidence.
Yeah. So I talked a little bit about windmills being these sort of open wounds. So in a way they become these structures of evidence on this infrastructure that we need, and also as an evidence, and a very sort of local evidence of the way that we have been living our lives the last many years, and that is sort of an affective relationship we have, because the windmills sort of have that much sort of gained that much attention in Denmark, at least. We can't ignore them anymore. So in that way, and because they generate so much sort of negative attention, it's because of the sensual and aesthetic dimensions of them, sort of the affective dimension of windmills. So in that sense, they become evidence, and an evidence that you can't really sort of block out, because you are sort of sensually bombarded by them. Yeah. And also they become, they also evidence of this interconnectivity and messy transductions, and all these sort of speculative translations of data that constantly go around when we talk about environmental data.
Thank you so much. So interesting.
Thank you very much, all of you. This was extremely rich and certainly stimulated my imagination to think outside of myself in so many different ways. We have 17 minutes left for questions. So please write them in the chat, and I will hand over to Morten to moderate questions, and maybe you also want to include the questions in the chat. Is that okay with you, Morten?
Sure. I was thinking to start with maybe having a round of questions among ourselves, the speakers, and those that have been in dialogue now. So, and then maybe move on to what is in the chat. So maybe a quick round, because I was just thinking, I mean, other questions might emerge, but I was just very taken by this, and I think it was you, Freya, also summing it up, that you are actually all of you addressing this notion of that the silence is the medium of this, or the noise is the medium, as Janna started by saying. So I was actually curious. I was sitting with a quote from Donna Haraway before we started this, from When Species Meet, a shorter paper she wrote in 2010, where she asked the question that I think is in the room everywhere in the dialogues we've had, and certainly is framing why I was also moving in the direction with the special section. What does it mean to live and die in a time of extinctions? And how she ends, that's the beginning of the quote, and then she ends the quote with a question: how to get from the Anthropocene to a more ongoing quiet country. And of course, here she speaks to the fact that she sees the methods she's developing is going in the direction of this notion, I would than say of silence as the medium, or this quiet country as she imagines. So there is a practice going in a direction of how to change stuff, but the changes can only be some way mediated through a human agency, or what. So that's maybe the question I could broadly ask. Do you see any of these silent mediations or the silent messages as impetus for real change, and how would that actually go about in the practices that you've been talking to and speaking to today? I don't know if anyone wants to. Oh, okay, Freya.
I think the key is grief. I think when we get in touch through listening to this loss and through these changes, it can elicit a real grief and sense of loss within ourselves. And I think from that place we can cultivate empathic connection. So I'm just going to put that out there, that there's a value in connecting to our grief through sound and through the loss that we're witnessing.
If I can jump in,
Sure.
I find that very, very provocative, and I think that question of grief is something that I'm going to sit with a little bit. But I actually wanted to point back to something else that I believe Freya said about the listening with. And for me, that's the thing that I kind of wrote down and circled, and is so key for me, and points to a sort of pause in the relentless production and the relentless creation. And also to modes of being in the world and responding to the world that are like emerging in relationship. And for me, from that place, different cultures would emerge.
Mm. Mm. Anyone wants to chip in? From across?
I could just add to Stephanie the aspect of time. It just reminds me why I turned from the visual to the sonic as a visual artist. Being trained as a visual artist was actually the frustration that people didn't spend time. So the sonic was a way of inviting or asking people to stay with an experience long enough to be able to notice a change. So that the temporal aspect of what listening does over time, I think it connects to what both of you were saying.
Yes, maybe we should take a question from the chat here. There are two. I don't know how to choose. There's 50-50 chance that you will get your question asked now. Okay, there is one directed to Tullis, Freya, and Janna. It goes like that. Considering the mentioned hierarchical relationship problems that present themselves in recording activities, could perhaps a more distributed agency in regard to the internal workings of the technologies and formats for reproduction, be that audio systems, etc., help generate a more reciprocal, ethical and shared culture, sound culture? So let's start with that. That's a sub question, but I think so this is, I guess, any one of you can of course chip in, but it's directed to Tullis, Freya, and Janna. Anyone wants to? Tullis.
I'll give it a go. Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, I think in some ways my response is that it's perhaps less of a question and more of a sort of provocation or a statement, to which my answer would be yes. I think that those relationships present problems and should be addressed, and The difficulty is how, and in practical terms. I mean, I think that it's a personal opinion of mine is that there's a sort of myth around the availability and proliferation of technologies and how those are widely available and becoming more accessible and cheaper. I think that there are some seriously unjust or unequal structural issues related to that, to do with various different axes of which we could think about. So yeah, I think that technologies do have that issue in the internal workings, they say, but also particularly the formats for reproduction or the accessibility with which somebody might if we're talking about hierarchies, there is an imbalance there. So I think it's the artist's prerogative to find ways to sidestep those as they currently exist, and to be playful and think through the technology only being a tool rather than being something more profound as part of the work, and also to think beyond. I think somebody brought this up earlier, and it's certainly in one of the papers, I think, to think beyond listening as an equal, to think more, I guess, more neurodiverse issues around listening and how people listen is related to that conversation as well.
Mm. I don't know if Freya or Janna, you have anything to add?
Just, briefly to add to what Tullis said. I think they're using these technologies. All of us here in this Zoom room right now are implicated through our use of technologies and our entanglement in extractive capitalism. And we can't get away from that. And I think it's important just to acknowledge it. And this is just the way things are right now. And I think acknowledgement is a first step.
Mm. Yeah. Good point. There is a question, goes in a bit in a different direction, but I guess it addresses the practice of this in a more general sense. So there's a question: how do you think we may use our own voices to learn how to practice listening with this vocal imitation and aid for listening with more awareness and connection? So that's for everyone.
I'd love to say something about this, because this is something that my artistic practice engages with. So I will just begin by saying, for me, yes. So something that I do in my own work is beginning with listening and field recordings as a way of listening to other species, and then practicing listening and sounding with those species, that I started doing with a sort of playful idea of learning their languages, and developing different kinds of relationships and learning from their languages, and maybe different senses of temporality. And also because in this practice of vocal imitation, I am pushed quite far outside of what is natural for me to do. So for me, it feels like a practice of decentering my own sort of anthropocentrism and human nature as an exercise that for me I find very meaningful. It's and it's a kind of a practice in process that I don't have any evidence for the efficacy of, but it certainly shifts the way that I move and relate in the world.
Mm. Yeah. Morten, you're actually asking a question. Do you want to ask it yourself?
It's just something that I've been thinking about the last hour. And in the conversation I had with Janna about that, maybe it's not, I mean, we normally would say that you could if you make a recording of something, then that can act as evidence in a whatever, because it's a document. But talking to you, Janna, I sort of realized that we can't use recording technology as evidence anymore, but it's rather listening or different modes of listening that can act as evidence. I don't know if it's a question or maybe just a comment or a statement.
That's interesting. Anyone want to dig on in that direction?
I could just say something briefly in relation to the way that I experienced making work through trying to record, like actually trying to create a recording of something that it was impossible to use a microphone to do, which was the sound of this organism. So it led to this sense of constructing a sound. And therefore, what I became aware of was that sense, like Bruno Latour talks about constructing in the context of scientific spaces, but this idea of being the author of the sound. And therefore that I see recording as being something similar. You're an author of a sound when you're recording a sound, because it's created in the way that you have constructed the situation. So whilst I'm not necessarily addressing your point about the listening, but I am thinking about how we're using that recording technology. So I think it very much is about how you perhaps listen as an author and take responsibility for what it is that you're listening to.
Or maybe not even as an author, but as a part of this transductive chain that you proposed. So author might lead in one direction of being in control, but we are one chain in a transductive chain that perceives but also changes the thing we are perceiving in order for being able to share it and to acknowledge the changes that happens in this receptive and transmissive ongoing mode is important to stay attuned to, I think.
Yeah, if I might add something, I was just really thinking about transduction and the transductive chains as being very productive, and how we're all translating, and how our bodies can also be our recording technologies. So I was just thinking about how we're all mediating different modes of listening or apprehending or attuning to the world and then translate it. So maybe we can think of recording technologies in a more productive way as transduction technologies. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I'm just like thinking about translating technology and transduction and bodies and how we are all mediating. And I'm thinking how then writing becomes also part of this inscription mechanism through which we make sound legible as another recording technology.
Exactly. And inscription then becomes something we need to do as well, to pick up things in other places, in other times, and in other contexts. And I think we did that here today, didn't we? I don't know, time is almost up. Janna, should we continue with the questions, or what do you think?
I think we have, unfortunately, to wrap it up. Thank you very much for the questions in the chat as well. It's been a very, very rich experience, and I'm so happy we could make it. Thank you everyone for joining in as well. And Cissi, would you like to just say something about it?
I would just like to say a warm thank you to all of you panelists. This was amazing to listen to, and I learned so much. So a big warm thank you to Janna and to the whole panel, to Morten, Tullis, Freya, and Gabriela, Louise, and Morten, with the absence present of Maria, Stephanie. So a warm thank you. And I would also like to just tell you a secret that actually we will soon advertise. But we are going to have the next Posthumanities Hub session on the 25th of March. And that too, my friends, will be in the Sonic register. So we will have Åsa Stjärna, and it will be the same time on the 25th of March. And it will be under the title of Sonic Visions of the Arctic. So I hope that you feel warmly invited to join us again, basically. So from Marietta and me and Janna, to all of you, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
So good to see you all from so diverse places. Yeah.
Thank you.